Maybe you've seen the latest program on JW Broadcast for March 2018. Brother Loesch gives a discussion on the importance of trust and the importance of trusting our brothers and trusting Jehovah. But most importantly, he emphasizes that it's important to trust the governing body, the faithful and discreet slave. Because after all, Jehovah trusts them, so why shouldn't we? And he strongly discourages Jehovah's Witnesses from paying attention to news items and things that they hear on YouTube, like this program that you're listening to, and other forms of social media. He mentions Facebook and Twitter. Well, obviously, the governing body is doing what they call damage control. The implication is that whatever you hear that doesn't come from the Watchtower is to be suspect, and it's probably not true. It's been twisted somehow. And that may be the case. I mean, a lot of what you read from ex-JWs, and they have their axe to grind, so to speak, but that doesn't necessarily mean what they say is untrue. Take just this past week, for example. It has come out in several news items that a long-running legal dispute between ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, people that have been sexually abused by this fellow named Campos in San Diego. He was an elder, and apparently the local elders knew about his propensity to abuse little boys, and they didn't do anything. And consequently, he abused several young boys. And the Watchtower, of course, said we didn't do anything wrong, blah, 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 blah. And the judge ordered them to turn over their records. They refused, and he fined them $4,000 a day, which went on for several years, and now finally that case is resolved out of court. Is it true? Well, the Watchtower will never say. Just mind your own business, apparently, is the way they see it, even though there are victims in this case, and they are held responsible for it. Well, if the news media were what they were saying was entirely fabricated, don't you think the Watchtower would sue them for libel? But we don't hear anything like that happening, do we? So we have to assume that there is an element of truth there. So obviously many of Jehovah's Witnesses are hearing these news reports. That wasn't an isolated incident by any means. An article that also came out last week said that in the UK, the government is considering an inquiry into the Watchtower's child abuse policy. Now, the Watchtower lawyers, oh, no, we abhor child abuse and all of that, but the government said there have been so many complaints, we have to take it seriously. So when Brother Loesch says you have to trust the governing body, that's becoming harder and harder for a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses to do. But this matter of trusting men, and even men whom, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, let's say they are the faithful and discreet slave. I can't find anything in the scriptures that say necessarily to trust them. You know, according to Jesus, the Watchtower, I mean, they say they've got it figured out, right? There's a new governing body member, so they're back up to 8. We are the faithful and discreet slave whom Christ appointed. Case closed. But Jesus phrased it as a question, didn't he? Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed for him to feed his domestics with food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master finds him doing so. If. Okay, so there's an appointment. Has he been faithful? We won't know that until the master returns. For many years, the Watchtower said that the master came in 1914 and appointed them over all of his belongings. Well, I wrote in the first edition of Jehovah Himself Has Become King in 2005 that even if the first appointment took place then, the second appointment is in the future. There are two appointments. The first appointment is to feed Christ's sheep. The second appointment, or his domestics, the second appointment is when the master comes and determines if that slave has been faithful to his original appointment. If yes, and only the master can make that determination. We can't. We say, I'm faithful. The Apostle Paul told the Corinthians, what is looked for in a steward is faithfulness. He says, don't judge anything until that day. So it's not our judgment that counts, is it? So when the master arrives, we're talking about the second coming of Christ. When the master arrives, then, if he finds that slave to have been faithful, then he appoints him over all of his belongings. But Jesus went into quite a lengthy explanation, revealing that he will not find all of those appointed to be faithful. There is an evil slave, and even though in 2013 the Watchtower brought their interpretation up to date as far as the future application, they pretty much dissolved the evil slave, because to leave that hanging would mean to imply that some of those in the governing body are not faithful or discreet. But if you read in the 12th chapter of Luke, where Jesus was speaking to his little flock and he was encouraging them to be ready for the return of their master, even if he appears to be delaying. And then Peter said, well, are you saying this to us or to all? And Jesus repeated it. He said this on two occasions. Who really then is the faithful and discreet slave? And in that account, in the 12th chapter of Luke, Jesus went on to say that there are two slaves that will be judged differently. One with the severest form of punishment, and another will be punished less severely. But both slaves are punished. The one slave is punished because he didn't know his master's will. He was ignorant about certain things, and so he couldn't comply fully. He'll be punished with a few strokes. The other slave knew his master's will and did not do in line with it, and he will be punished with many strokes. In other words, as Jesus says, put out into the outer darkness where the weeping and gnashing of his teeth will be. So it's a little premature for the Watchtower to claim that they are the faithful and discreet slave. It's just a formality that they will be appointed over all the master's belongings. And by the way, if you listen to or watch that video, Brother Lowe said that the slaves being appointed over all of the master's belongings will be fulfilled when all of those slaves are in heaven with Christ. And that's not necessarily true. His appointment comes when Christ returns in his authentic parousia, and his slaves see him as he is, as the Apostle John said. And when they are sealed, that is when that appointment takes place over all of his belongings, before they are transformed into spirits. But I won't get into that. I have written a fair bit about that in the book Jehovah Himself Has Become King, and also on my website, ewatchman.com. At any rate, back to this business of trusting. If you read the scriptures, and I know many of you have and are well read in the scriptures, You will not find anything where God encourages his followers to trust in men. And the Watchtower would agree with that on the face of it. But it gets a little tricky because they're encouraging us to trust Jehovah, but trust them as if they are Jehovah as well, right? Jehovah has entrusted the slave, so why shouldn't you? Well, as I mentioned, the slave has not been defined yet as having been faithful. You know, in the time of Jeremiah, the Jews had, they had the temple of Jehovah there in their midst. And they felt that that was some sort of safeguard for them. And it's easy to understand why they had that feeling. It wasn't necessarily their reverence, but some years earlier, the king of Assyria had completely desolated northern Israel, the 10 tribes, and he was pretty heady about taking out Jerusalem as well. That was the prize, the temple and all the gold and all of that. And Jehovah told King Hezekiah through Isaiah that he will not come into Jerusalem, and you won't even have to fight him. And the Bible account shows that Jehovah sent an angel out, and he just wiped out King Sennacherib's army while they slept. And they were ready to take out Jerusalem. And so the Jews felt like, Jehovah would never destroy this city. That's the place where Jehovah had put his name. The temple was Jehovah's center of worship, right? Well, I'd like to read you a scripture. The battery on my iPad is dead. I didn't have time to charge it, but see how this phone works out. Lettering is kind of small for me. Anyway, I just want to mention, other than reading scriptures, I don't have a teleprompter or anything, or notes, or I don't memorize. And sometimes I make, inaccurate or wrong statements, sort of like a typo, I suppose. But I can't do it any other way. I like not knowing what I'm going to say. I just turn the camera on. I pray and turn the camera on, and, if I have something to say, it'll come out, and otherwise, no. But this is real handy for reading the scriptures because I don't have them memorized. Anyway, this is in the 7th chapter of Jeremiah, and Jehovah speaks to this people and says, "Reform your ways and your actions, and I will allow you to keep residing in this place. Do not put your trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah.' For if you truly reform your ways and actions, if you truly uphold justice between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress foreign residents, orphans, and widows, and sexually abuse children, if you do not shed innocent blood in this place, unjustly disfellowshipping people." There's a woman here in Michigan about 20 miles up the road, killed her family. You probably heard about that a few weeks ago. The media said, her neighbor said it was because she was shunned by her congregation. But if you do not shed innocent blood, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, or you could say if you do not idolize the earthly organization. Paul had a problem with that in the first century. He spoke to the Corinthians and said, "Some of you are saying I belong to Paul, and I..." He said, "Paul didn't die for you, did he?" Well, we could say the same thing. Did the faithful slave die for you? It says, if If you do not follow other gods, then I will allow you to keep residing in this place, in the land I gave to your forefathers for all time. But you are putting your trust in deceptive words, and it will bring absolutely no benefit. Can you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make sacrifices to Baal, and follow other gods you had not known, and then come and stand before me and the house that bears my name and say, we will be saved, despite your doing all these detestable things? Has this house that bears my name become a cave of robbers in your eyes? Here, I have seen it for myself, declares Jehovah. Well, we can certainly make the case that the Watchtower is the place where Jehovah caused his name to reside. Who can argue that the Watchtower has published the name of Jehovah far and wide in hundreds of languages? When someone hears the name of Jehovah, they say, well, are you one of Jehovah's Witnesses? And more than likely they are. And we know, too, that there is a spiritual temple, which is basically Christ's congregation. And whereas the Watchtower says that Jehovah's Witnesses are in a spiritual paradise, the scriptures show that that is not the case until Christ returns. Because up until then, just as I mentioned, there's a faithful and unfaithful slave. Jesus gave another illustration of the wheat and the weeds. And the Watchtower says, well, yeah, the angels harvested the weeds out way back in 1918. That was Christendom. Well, if that's true, how have the parishioners of Christendom been bundled up and burned in the fire? Aren't there new successive generations of weeds popping up? And if the wheat have been set aside in the storehouse, and Jesus, went on to say that the angels will clear out of his kingdom all things that cause stumbling and all persons doing lawlessness. Now that's a permanent, unequivocal cleansing. Remove all things that cause stumbling. Aren't there things that cause stumbling among Jehovah's Witnesses? When the governing body has to tell Jehovah's Witnesses, don't read this, don't read that, don't listen to these news reports, don't watch the YouTube, don't believe any of that, just believe us. If they have to go to that extent, then obviously there are some serious stumbling blocks that they are, like I say, trying to do damage control over. So, this hasn't happened yet, this cleansing. Some people, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, they feel that because the Watchtower has been false, that it couldn't possibly be Jehovah's organization as advertised. And part of that problem or blame resides with the Watchtower for presenting itself as this beacon on the hill. Well, just because, they know the basic truths, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have God's approval, as the scripture in Jeremiah said. If you do the right thing, if you turn away from these bad things, then the Watchtower says, well, we have no need of repentance. We abhor child abuse, and on and on and on. So, there are dozens and dozens of scriptures. If you just enter the word trust in your CD-ROM or on the Watchtower's website, over and over and over again, we're exhorted to trust Jehovah. But we're never exhorted to trust men. The only men we can really trust are those who were inspired when they wrote the Bible. And we have their words. Jehovah oversaw it and made sure that in spite of human perfection or whatever, his words, thoughts were conveyed correctly. And of course, we can trust Jesus. So we really have to question why the Watchtower now is so adamant that we trust them. And I'm afraid it's not so innocent. I'm sure that there are authentic Christians among the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm just as convinced that there are wicked ones, an evil slave, and those who are false apostles, really. Paul had to deal with that again in the Corinthian congregation. There were those who apparently they were Greek orators, and they could have the congregation spellbound, apparently, and they disrespected Paul, in his absence, of course. And said, well, his presence is weak. Yeah, sure, his letters are weighty, but his presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. Well, Paul had a chance to sort of set the record straight, didn't he? He said, these men are false apostles, deceitful workers. They've transformed themselves into ministers of Christ. And says it's no wonder, because Satan keeps transforming himself into an angel of light. So it's no big deal if these men are able to do that. So it's not so easy, is it, to see the wheat from the weeds. In fact, we can't see it. The Corinthians couldn't see it. The Apostle Paul was inspired. So God allowed him to see through this satanic deception. So that's a dynamic at work among Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's not so easy as the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses would have you believe. Oh, the Watchtower is a false prophet. This couldn't possibly be Jehovah's organization. Well, that's not the way I see it, based upon the Scriptures. There is a judgment and a refining. And some will be put aside, and others will be allowed to go forward into the blessing. See, the whole point comes down to Jehovah wants to find out if we trust him. And it's pretty easy, to follow the Watchtower's program and go to the meeting, go out to service. They give you all the materials and all of that and underline the correct answer. And you have, a supportive network of friends that are there for you. And that's great. That's, I think, a provision from Jehovah. But if you know anything about the truth, then you know the great issue that Satan has raised, whether God is really trustworthy himself. And if we're put to the test, will we really trust him? It's easy when everybody else is doing it and, you follow the leader and all of that. But you remember when Satan came before Jehovah and Jehovah's like, spit it out. What is it? With this man Job, you see, when Satan says, well, is it for nothing that Job serves God? You put a hedge around him. You bless him to the hilt. Who wouldn't? Take all that away. And you'll see. He'll curse you to your face. Well, we might say Job settled the issue, but he didn't really, because here we are. And Satan is still here, and the issue has not been settled yet. Take the example when the apostles, I've mentioned this many, many times, that they just couldn't grasp the fact that Jesus was going to be killed. And on the night when Jesus was arrested, he told Peter, he said, look, Satan has demanded to have you men to sift you as wheat, but I've made supplication that your faith does not give out. And so that sifting began almost immediately when Jesus was arrested and Peter was thrown off balance and he denied even knowing Jesus after he said he would die for him. But Jehovah concealed the reality of Jesus' death from them in order that they could be tested. And Jehovah is for us. He knows that we do have the capacity to trust him and the faith. And so he lets us demonstrate that. And so, the same dynamic now, he has allowed this deluding influence to go forth. Go to 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, and Paul was talking about the return of Christ. He says, don't be quickly alarmed as to the presence of Christ and the day of Jehovah is here, announcements to that effect. And he said, even if you hear reports and letters as though from us saying that here's the Christ, don't believe it. It will not come unless the apostasy comes first. Well, it's interesting that the governing body have really set themselves up as apostles. There was a Watchtower article, I commented on it, and under the Watchtower review column on the Watchman's Post. Those who are saying they are apostles, which is what Jesus said to those in his congregation in Revelation. In the article, they referred to the apostles as the governing body. Not just once, at least a dozen times. The governing body in the first century said this. The governing body, and Paul, a member of the so on, so on, so on. Well, that's not inappropriate to refer to the apostles as a governing body. They were a governing organ, and they were a body of men. So, okay, they're a governing body. That's not an inaccurate statement. But the fact that the Watchtower used that phrase over and over and over again, it is, I believe, to inject into the minds of Jehovah's Witnesses that not only were the apostles the governing body now are of the same stature as the apostles. So here was Paul warning, don't believe it even if you receive letters or magazines or pamphlets or booklets as though from us, saying the day of Jehovah is here. Well, that's been the message of the Watchtower since day one. And I've mentioned this many times, probably too many times, but the Watchtower used to say that the presence began in 1874 and that Christ's kingdom was set up in 1878. And then when 1914 came and went, and like 20 years later, then they moved the parousia up to 1914. But for 150 years, the Watchtower has been saying the presence and the day of Jehovah are here. The exact thing Paul said not to believe. The presence will not begin until the apostasy comes. And I believe that apostasy will come through the Watchtower, through the governing body. And, well, just imagine what will happen. I mean, in Brother Loesch's talk again, he mentioned, and they repeat this over and over and over again, we're near to the beginning of the tribulation. And it's always implied that's the next thing to be fulfilled in prophecy. Everything else has been fulfilled beginning in 1914, everything. Only the Great Tribulation. And as I've pointed out over and over and over again, Jesus Christ did not begin ruling as king in 1914. That's the deluding influence that Paul warned that God would allow to go to those who know the truth. Why? In order to test your love of the truth. Satan has demanded to have you, to sift you as wheat. And this whole deluding influence set up by a man of lawlessness who is in the temple, the spiritual temple, right? The temple of Jehovah we are, right? So the man of lawlessness is backed up, what did Paul say, by an operation of Satan, with every lying sign and powerful work and deceptive thing. Well, Satan implanted that thought through this chronology. And 7 times Jesus, when he spoke about the appointed times of the nations, there's no way he was saying that it began with the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He was talking about a future fall of Jerusalem, which would mark the beginning of the appointed times of the nations to trample Jerusalem. And not the literal city, but the figurative, the spiritual, the temple, where Jehovah placed his name. So here is this deluding influence. What happens when the real parousia begins? When Christ returns? When Satan is cast down from heaven? When there's war and famine and pestilence? All the things that Jehovah's Witnesses point to the past, the receding past. 100 years ago, there was a big war. A few million people died of the Spanish influenza. But here we are on the cusp of a war between nuclear powers, something that's never happened before. And they have weapons now that are being developed that are just unbelievable. Robots and drones and hypersonic missiles that fly at 6,000 miles an hour. So what happens when all these things begin? Will the Watchtower be there to hold your hand and to explain all this? Absolutely not. They'll have no credibility, for one thing. All they can do is say, don't believe the rockets flying overhead. Jesus came already and blah, blah, whatever. Well, as far as trusting, we were in Jeremiah 7. Go to Micah chapter 7. And it's referring to God's people here again. He said, their best one is like thorns. Their most upright one is worse than a thorn hedge. We abhor child abuse. And yet they know that thousands and thousands of people, children, have been abused under their watch. And they know they have a database of over 20,000 pedophiles. And they will never admit that. What a thorn hedge to try to work through this mess. The day of your watchmen and of your reckoning will come. Hey. Now they will panic. Do not put your faith in a companion or trust a close friend. Guard what you say to the one who lies in your embrace. For a son despises his father, a daughter rises up against her mother, and a daughter-in-law is against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his household. But as for me, I will keep on the lookout for Jehovah. I will show a waiting attitude for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Here, on the one hand, you have the Watchtower saying, trust us. Trust us. And here we have the scriptures in Jeremiah, do not put your trust in these deceptive words. And here, do not put faith in a companion or trust a close friend. And of course, Jesus quoted from this psalm from Micah here on a couple of occasions. He said that a man's enemies will be persons of his own household. And then in his discussion on the conclusion of the system of things, he said children will rise up and have their parents put to death. Parents will have their children put to death. Brothers will hate one another and betray one another. How can that possibly come about among Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, it's already happening, isn't it, to an extent? But again, as I say, what happens when the authentic sign of Christ's presence presents itself? That'll be a massive stumbling block. How could this have happened? So those with faith will go forward without the Watchtower. That's what Jehovah wants to see. That's how you will demonstrate that you have faith in Jehovah. Because the Watchtower is going to go down. And if you go down with it, then that's it. But the Watchtower has served a useful function in teaching the basic truth and helping us to develop a relationship with Jehovah. But then we have to, well, what's the scripture say? The tested quality of our faith. Unless we're really tested, do we really have faith? And Jesus left us with another one of those questions, like who really is the faithful slave? He said, when the Son of Man arrives, will he really find that faith? I think he will, but it's not going to be something he finds in everyone. So as Paul said, we want to be the sort that have faith to the preserving alive of our souls. And to that end, I'm trying to do my part as a watchman to prepare people for what is to come. So thank you for watching, and I'll try to do another one of these next week.